Hello, lovers of God. Saint Titus Brandsma was a Carmelite mystic who was killed in a concentration camp. But that's not the most powerful part of the story to me. The most powerful story is what happened next. He had such a profound effect on the nurse who killed him, on the nurse who delivered his lethal injection, that she would testify at his beatification hearing. She risked being persecuted and prosecuted for war crimes by testifying at his beatification, claiming that she was there because she knew that she killed a saint. When I first heard this story, I was so moved that I did an episode on it in 2024. And the episode was so haunting and so moving. Doing the research was so heavy but beautiful on me that I actually had to take a break from my podcast for a couple months. So when we talk about St. Titus, when we reflect upon St. Titus, he is the perfect saint to talk about the next part of our Sorrowful Mystery series, which is the carrying of the cross. So right after this, I'm going to share a piece from my 2024 episode. It's a bit long, but it's a retelling of the nurse, Tizia is the name she went by, and her testimony at his beatification. I hope you check it out, and I hope you listen to this entire episode as we reflect upon St. Titus and the carrying of the cross. Also, I encourage you to like and subscribe, as well as listen to my other reflections as I connected the sorrowful mysteries with the saints. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and I really hope this introduces you to a very new saint. He was canonized in 2022, but also a saint that is so very important for our times. I hope you enjoy, and God bless. Bishop Wilhelm Mutzgertz sat in the front of a small crowded conference room with a big smile on his face. The bishop was a large and jovial Dutchman. He was bald with a blonde mustache, and he wore a grin that made you think he was always on the verge of cracking a joke, or always just a few moments away from laughter. The bishop was warm, caring, and he was well liked in his diocese. And this optimism and this energy, it was needed now more than ever, because less than 10 years ago, hundreds of Dutch Catholics were killed in concentration camps. And not only the Netherlands, but most of Europe was only beginning to pick up the pieces, including his small but resilient diocese. As he sat at the podium, the bishop looked at the faces of all of those who were gathered, priests, cardinals, lawyers, his parishioners, his friends. And while he looked at them with his trademark painted-on smile, inside the bishop also knew the pain that each of these people was still feeling. And he prayed to God that this hearing today would result in joy rather than sorrow. And he silently prayed that the events today would not reopen too many wounds, especially as many gathered here just began taking the small steps towards normalcy. The bishop then banged a gavel and called the hearing into order. He began casually. As you all know, we are here to continue taking testimonies for the life of a very holy and revered man in hopes of his future beatification and his eventual sainthood. When you are called up, please have a seat at the table in front of me, and then myself and our secretaries, we will guide you through your statements. Please take your time in answering. We want to ensure that every bit of information is as accurate and thorough as possible before we send it to Rome for review. Now, who is next? A woman emerged from the back, raising her hands and walking towards the table. She was a younger woman wearing a black dress with black hair tied tightly in a bun. She kept her eyes to the floor as she walked to the table. She then nervously pulled out the metal chair and sat at the desk. Her fingers clasped around one another on the table. One could see her breathing was heavy, and the bishop sensed her anxiety. He tried his best to catch her eye and give her his infectious smile, but the woman remained timid. Okay, ma'am, please begin with your name and then the testimony that you have prepared. If we have any questions, we will be sure to wait until you are finished to ask them. The woman finally looked up to meet the eyes of the bishop, and then she began sheepishly. In order to protect myself and due to the severity of my testimony today, I have been given permission from Rome to not use my real name. Therefore, I will be going by the name Tizia this afternoon. The bishop, realizing who the woman was, nodded knowingly, and the crowd before him leaned in, all very captivated and interested in what this Tizia was going to say and reveal. Meanwhile, she pulled out a stack of papers from a manila folder and began to read. I bear witness to the holiness of this individual because I have personal knowledge. I was at the Dachau concentration camp from April to October of 1942, and there I got to know the subject of this hearing, Father Titus, a week before his death. As you may have assumed by now, I was not a prisoner at the Dachau concentration camp, but rather I worked there. I served as a nurse in the infirmary. I visited Father Titus twice a day, totaling to perhaps 15 or so visits, meeting with him for 10 or 20 minutes each time. When I was only 16 years old, I became a nurse in Berlin for the Red Cross. And during that time, we had to say an oath to take Hitler as our God and promise to never attend a church of any kind. We were told that churches of all types were only full of deceit, and also that the Jews needed to be completely exterminated. I was so young, I did not understand the consequences of this. Therefore, when clergy began filing into the camp at Dachau, I already had a distaste for them. Though the hatred of the guards and the SS, it eventually rubbed off on me. I did not see them as humans, but I saw them as leaders of deceit, someone, or rather something, that needed to be silenced. And when Father Titus came into the infirmary, it did not matter that his illness was treatable. At that time, he was already earmarked as a man who needed to die. The doctors were going to run cruel experiments on him until they eventually no longer had use of his body. Then they would kill him and discard of his remains. And as cold as that sounds, it was so common. I began seeing this type of treatment of men as routine. Not to mention, I hated priests. I found many of the priests who came into the infirmary to be irritating, and at the time I saw their pleas for help as pathetic. But there was something about Father Titus. He suffered immensely. He was already a walking skeleton due to the regular treatment of camp prisoners. And he came in with a case of dysentery and a bowel infection. And now, on top of that, he was undergoing these abhorrent experiments. So he was in great pain, a pain that I could never imagine, and yet he was joyful. Before I would enter his room to check on his vitals, I would see other patients around his bedside asking for advice or even receiving confession. Once I walked into Father Titus's room and a patient was crying at his bedside. And I heard Father Titus, who again was dying, who could barely speak or move without severe pain. And I hear him, this dying priest, consoling a patient, saying, oh, that's not too bad. Be kind to yourself. God loves you, never forget that. And I remember thinking, what kind of man is this? What kind of man could preach God's love in this literal hell that we are in? Who would comfort a rather healthy patient while they themselves were dying? The doctors who were torturing him, they once even remarked that Father Titus had a supernatural grace about him. They joked that we must be careful or Father Titus might pray and then a cross will appear in the sky and the war might end. And they weren't mocking his piety either. They really believed this. I personally know a few guards who were so moved by how he'd received beatings with grace. And then he'd be heard praying for them silently in the makeshift chapel that they built. And as for me personally, I recall wheeling him back from these vicious experiments. And he would always reach behind and grab my hand. And each time he did that, he would tell me that he prays for me a lot. And at first I laughed it off. At first it made me mad. But he kept saying it. He kept telling me that he prays for me. Why? Why is he praying for me? Was this a tactic? Was this manipulation? No, I don't think so. I don't believe so. And he would tell me so often that he was praying for me that eventually I believed him. I believed that he was praying for me. Then one day, he gave me this. He must have known that he was going to die because he gave this rosary to me, and he asked me to pray it. I told him I can't pray, and even if I were allowed, I don't remember the prayers. And he said, and I'll never forget this, he said, "At least recite 'Pray for us sinners.' Can you do that?" And for the first time, I smiled at the man, and I slipped the rosary into my apron pocket. And it was maybe a few hours after that I was given the orders. I was called into his room, and he was laying there unconscious. And I remember how peaceful he looked. I also remember reaching into my apron. I remember fiddling around in my pocket, having to move the rosary beads aside to grab the syringe. And when I pulled out the syringe, for the first time, I felt sick. For the first time, I felt irritated. I will even say for the first time, I felt evil. And then I inserted the syringe into his arm. I lost this rosary after Dachau closed. But when I found it shortly after the war, all of this came flooding back to me. My guilt, my sorrow, my self-hatred. I hated myself, but this man prayed for me. I ran to a Carmelite convent where they too greeted me with love. And despite my ultimate sin, the church has accepted me with love too. I am here today because I killed a holy man. I am here today because I killed a saint. I am here today because I killed Titus Brandsma, and I want the world to know of his sanctity. Peace be with you and with your spirit. Welcome to another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. I am your host, W. So far in this series, we have discussed the agony in the garden. We have discussed the scourging at the pillar. We have discussed the crowning with thorns. And all of those symbolize a very important part in our own spiritual path. They represent purging. This is most obviously seen in the crowning with thorns. This is indicative of purging ourselves of self-importance. So when Christ is going through his passion, he is also teaching us a way to atone and unite with God. This is why it is called the Via Crucis, the way of the cross, because this is a spiritual path for you and I as well. Just as Christ had to purge himself of self-importance, which he did on our behalf, he did not have to do that because he is God. We need to purge ourselves too before we can unite with God, before we can resurrect and ascend in a way and unite with God. We must go through this purging as well. So we've already gone through that in the mysteries, in the sorrowful mysteries. So now we are focusing on the carrying of the cross. Here we see the purging has been done. Now it is time to do the work. Now it is time to make the sacrifice. And what is the sacrifice? Now, we can get into atonement theories in a future episode. But to summarize, it's this. The goal of the sacrifice is to unite his sufferings with the Father as a prayer to save souls and to reveal God to the world. That is the way of the cross. It is revealing God to the world through suffering. That is what Christ did. And it is using that suffering and that sacrifice as a prayer to save souls. So when we talk about carrying the cross, that is what we begin doing. We begin to do the work. We begin to make sacrifices that reveal God to the world and serve as a prayer to the Father to forgive those away from Him. So we see this in many ways in our spiritual life, and it can be very practical, right? When we serve the poor, we reveal God to the poor. When we feed the hungry, in a way, we reveal God. We reveal that God is plentiful. When we love our enemy, we reveal that God is loving. But then there comes the supernatural element, and that is the redemptive suffering. That is when we use our pain as a prayer to God. When Christ was suffering on the cross, it was an intercessory prayer to forgive the souls of others. This is called redemptive suffering. It's a very important part of Catholicism. If you are watching this in the Lenten season, do you know why you are fasting right now? It's because you're partaking in redemptive suffering. You are supposed to be using that discomfort of a fast as a prayer so that God will have mercy on your souls and the soul of everyone away from Him. And it does not have to be fasting as well. If you are experiencing any kind of pain, a headache, a stubbed toe, or something more severe, you can offer that pain as a sacrifice to God, asking Him to shine His face on those away from Him. So you have two important parts of the Via Crucis, of the way of the cross. And that is offering up our suffering as a prayer, or our sacrifice as a prayer. Because it can also be sacrificing your time in feeding the hungry, sacrificing your time preaching the gospel. But it can also be offering up pain too. And the second, which is the most important, and that is revealing God to the world. Christ's main mission was to reveal God to the world. It is said that God did not take flesh so that He would change His mind about us, but so that we would change our mind about God. No longer a distant figure, now someone we can see and identify with. That is why our God was not born in a kingdom of riches, but born into poverty, because we can identify with Him and He can identify with us. But here, in the Passion, ultimately, He will reveal Himself to the world through His resurrection and ascension. And now, in the mystical body, baptized in the Holy Spirit at the Pentecost, you and I are called to reveal God to the world as well through our actions. And that is the sacrifice. That is the carrying of the cross. And there are many, many, many figures in our faith who have done this, who have exemplified using sacrifice, suffering, and pain as a revelation of Christ to the world. But we specifically see that in the martyrs of our faith, those who have risked their lives to reveal God to the world, who have put their lives on the line and paid the ultimate price to push forward the mercy and the beautiful message of our Lord. And one man that I would like to talk about today is a very recent saint, and a saint that I hope becomes your friend. And that is Saint Titus Brandsma. So, as with every saint in this series, I have a full episode on them in which I go into extensive detail about their lives. And the same for Titus Brandsma. Titus Brandsma is perhaps one of my favorite saints and one of my favorite mystics. I really hate to use this reductive analogy, but he is almost the Carmelite mystic version of Max Kolbe. However, unlike St. Kolbe, we have even more personal testimony and witnesses to the life of St. Titus Brandsma. That includes his execution in the Dachau concentration camp, because it wasn't a kill camp. Most of them were just held prisoner, but of course they did kill many people there. It wasn't like Auschwitz, which was, you go there to die. So we have a lot of testimony, and he was kind of a public figure as well. So we have so much information about this incredible saint, also a very new saint, so not that many people are familiar with him. But I'm going to be barely scratching the surface. Again, check out my full podcast episode on him. I'll also leave some biography links in the comments below. there actually are not that many in English. There's like one or two. Right here is a collection of his writings. But again, please check out more of this great saint. I'm going to give you a very high-level overview to the point where I'm almost ashamed that I'm not going into great detail. But he was born in 1881. He was born as Anno Brandsma. And he was born to a very Catholic family. And this is interesting because the Netherlands was very, very much Protestant. So the Catholic community was growing and they were very tight-knit. But there weren't that many of them. And he was born to a family of dairy farmers. And there were 4 children. And all of them became religious. All of them joined religious orders, aside from one. So Titus had a brother who was a Franciscan. So from a very young age, he wanted to be a Franciscan as well. However, and this is a story of many saints, you see this a lot, he was too sickly to join the Franciscans. He battled many ailments as a young man. A lot of digestive and stomach-related issues as well as bladder-related issues. They plagued him for the rest of his life. So the Franciscans, of course, that involves a lot of a life of poverty, even being a traveling missionary, depending on the order you're joining. So he decided to look into other religious orders. And he had a cousin, kind of a distant cousin, who joined this very ancient religious order that were new to the Netherlands, and they were called the Carmelites. And Anno Brandsma at the time, he was very interested in the Carmelites. He was interested in the hermitage history of them. They are said to have their origins with the prophet Ezekiel in the mountains of Carmel, and they would eventually become a full-on monastic order. And he was also very entranced by the mysticism of the Carmelite order. So, long story short, he joined the Carmelites. And this was great for a man who suffered from a lot of illnesses, right? Because the Carmelites, they are pretty cloistered. They're semi-cloistered. And for instance, you do not have a roommate, you have your own cell, and a lot of your time is spent in contemplative prayer. So this was great for a man who struggled with health issues. So he would join the Carmelites and he would take the name Titus, and he took this to honor his father. And he quickly became entranced and entrenched in the Carmelite way of life. He would study mysticism, he would study all sorts of theology, eventually getting his PhD from Rome. And then eventually he would also open a Catholic university. He would be a co-founder of the Catholic University of Nijmegen, and he would serve as the professor of theology as well as a professor of the history of mysticism. For a short while, he would also be the rector of this university. And he was kind of your archetype of the absent-minded professor. Always forgetting things, always having so much going on. But his classes were very, very popular because he was a master when it came to the history of the mystical tradition of our faith. So he was also kind of becoming very in demand for his lectures as well. He went on various lecture tours in Ireland as well as the United States. He wrote an essay where he was overlooking the Niagara Falls. It was a very beautiful essay. I recommend you check that out. But really, all you need to know, a very, very prolific writer and professor on the history of mysticism. But it did not end there. He began writing as well. First, he began translating a lot of works. For instance, the writings of St. Teresa of Avila were not available in Dutch, so he began to translate those. And then he also began writing a series of articles in Catholic newspapers and Dutch newspapers. And his work was very much appreciated, to the point he became the ecclesiastic advisor to all of the Catholic newspapers throughout the Netherlands. And you also need to realize the importance of newspapers back then. The main way that Catholics would receive information from Rome, as well as from their home diocese, as well as their parishes, were through these newspapers. So a very, very important way of life. So he would become the ecclesiastic advisor to these newspapers, which was essentially like an editor, just they are speaking on behalf of the church. So he was kind of the publisher in a way. Before they wrote anything, it had to kind of get sign-off from Titus Brandsma. And that's when things start getting interesting. Even before the Nazis took over the Netherlands, Titus Brandsma was very outspoken regarding Nazism. He would speak about how it is not compatible with the faith, so on and so forth. So when in 1940 the Nazis took control of the Netherlands, they were already aware of who they deemed this dangerous little friar. Eventually, their Department of Information, I'm using air quotes if you're listening to the audio version, the Nazi Department of Information, they put out a press release essentially saying all Catholic newspapers have to publish everything that the Nazis send them. Every advertisement, every article, if they send it to these newspapers, the newspapers have to post it. And, of course, Titus Brandsma pushed back. He was very public. He went on radio. He went on various speaking and lecture tours telling people that this is not the Catholic way. And, of course, he was also doing this with the understanding and at the behest of the Cardinal and Archbishop, Cardinal de Jong. So he was very outspoken about not publishing these things. And then the Nazis, they pushed back again, sending more letters saying, no, if you do not do this, you will be prosecuted. That is when Titus began to write letters to all of the editors of the Catholic newspapers, and he went out to deliver them. And he did not send them in the mail because the Nazis were opening everyone's mail, so he delivered them on foot. And that is when he got into trouble. So after delivering 14 letters to 14 editors, one day there was a knock at the door of his monastery, and 2 men dressed as students asked to see Professor Brandsma. And when Titus walked down the stairs, they revealed that they were not students, but members of the Nazi Party, and they were here to arrest Titus for disobeying orders of the Nazi Party, as well as going against their wishes regarding publication. So Titus would then be held in 2 prisons, Amersfoort and Stavanger. And these were kind of like holding cells before trial, essentially. And here he did not think that he was really their main target. He was a 60-year-old friar in pretty ill health. So they took him to these 2 kind of holding cells. And something very interesting happened. Because for the first time, he had time on his hands. He wasn't teaching, he wasn't doing his lectures, he wasn't managing all of his newspapers. He had time to write his biography of St. Teresa of Avila. He had time to work on a meditation on the Stations of the Cross for a new chapel. It was a chapel of St. Boniface that was being built. And he had time to pray the hours. And it's said that just like St. John of the Cross, who was kept in his cell, Titus had a spiritual awakening of sorts, perhaps one of the many in his life. He would say that they can take away my habit, they can take away my rosary, but they will never separate me from the love of God. So here he was in these 2 holding cells. And they gave him an opportunity. He essentially thought this was a scare tactic, and everyone else agreed. His monastery agreed, his cardinal, his archbishop agreed, even politicians that he knew agreed. This is just a scare tactic. So they took him in, the Nazis took him in, and they asked him to basically denounce his previous statements. They asked him to write a new statement saying that Catholics should and can publish what the Nazis are telling them. And he did not. In fact, he said the exact opposite. He wrote this response, which almost reads like a prayer, which is basically saying, no, I am not going to do this. It is not representative of God. What they are trying to say is what we would now consider anti-Semitic. It is evil. These are not good things. So they sent him back to his prison. They then sent him to a new jail, a new prison system, where he was given another chance to denounce what he was saying. And again, he wrote the same thing, essentially saying, no, he cannot in good conscience do this. This is against his faith, this is against Christ, and it is against the church. He even wrote to The Hague during this time, because he thought, oh, this is going to get settled. But even the people at The Hague were like, hey, you had 2 chances to basically rectify this, and you didn't. So maybe you should have. But St. Titus, or just Titus then, he wouldn't have done that. He stood for truth, and he stood for goodness. So then he would be taken to Dachau. Dachau was one of the first concentration camps. And initially it was truly a kind of like a place to scare people into behaving correctly. And eventually it became even more evil and vile. And like I said previously, I believe, it wasn't a kill camp at first. It wasn't like Auschwitz, which were designed for people to go there to die. They did kill people, as we'll learn. But you had a lot of people, you had a few more survivors. So that is why we have all of these testimonies of St. Titus. So we have to remember that St. Titus was already struggling with his health. He was very ill and it was only getting worse. And he was often kept in the infirmary. And he was kept in the infirmary in many other places. But here it would be much, much worse. And he was routinely beaten, savagely beaten, forced to do manual labor. However, despite this, despite being starved, he would often give his food to others. And he would be in the infirmary, dying himself, essentially. But he would crawl out of bed because he could not walk at points because he was so sick. He said his feet were swollen with edema. He could not move. But he would crawl to people and give them their last rites. And he would also just be encouraging. Here's one quote from a fellow prisoner. "Between the evening meal and the moment the lights went out, you had half an hour for yourself, but you were not allowed to leave the barracks. That was strictly forbidden. But Titus did it anyway. While others were spending those paltry 30 minutes on themselves, he risked his life to see if anyone else needed his spiritual support. In particular, he looked for prisoners of whom it was known would be executed shortly afterwards. And that made a big impression on me as well. He was a true shepherd of souls. So he would risk his life to go and hear confession to people that were about to die, or give last rites of people in the infirmary. There were also times in which the Eucharist would be smuggled in, and Titus would get his hands on it and go and administer it to his fellow Catholics. But again, he was already sick, and there's so much more I'm glossing over, and I get into it in my full episode. But he was already sick, and it was only getting worse. And one day, while working in the hot fields, he fell over, he collapsed, and the cruel guards, these guards who were always essentially trying to hurt him more, always beating him, they recommended he go to the hospital. And of course, this was a major red flag, because they knew this hospital was not a hospital. It was where you would go to die. And now we know that the hospital was where the infamous Nazi human experiments were going on. Various experiments, such as how bodies can withstand hypothermia, how bodies react to certain infections, so on and so forth. They would purposely freeze prisoners to death. They would infect their blood with infection and watch them die. So going there was a death sentence. And eventually, he was forced to go there by the guards. So over the first few weeks, he was there for a few weeks, he was going through these inhumane, disgusting experiments. And now we know he likely was with the people who were having all of these strange things injected into their blood and then fighting the infections off and suffering until they died. And that is when he began to form a friendship with a Nazi nurse who we now know goes by the name Tizia, at least in the beatification hearing. And he gave her his rosary and asked her to pray it. And he prayed for her, and he really had an effect on this nurse. And she hated priests, but she said there was something different about Titus. She said that he had a holiness about him, and even the most vile Nazi guards agreed. And also, despite being in an immense amount of pain, she said that Titus would go and take care of those in the hospital. He would hear them. He would hear their confessions. They would go up to him as he was dying on his deathbed, and he would console them. And it was this nurse, Tizia, who would give him his injection, his mercy killing. And she said that she went to go do this, and she felt awful already. And this was new for her because she hated priests. But for the first time, she started to feel empathy, and she reached into her pocket, and she moved past the rosary to get to the syringe. And she said that's when the veil fell from her eyes. That's when she realized how evil she was being. But she did it. She killed Titus Brandsma with her injection, and she could never forgive herself. She would be so moved by this holy man that she would risk her life, risk trials for war crimes, by testifying at his beatification hearing, claiming, "I am here because I killed a holy man. I am here because I killed a saint." It was because of Titus that she would rejoin the Catholic Church, because she was born Catholic. And she would spend the rest of her life in prayer and penance. Again, I'm skipping very much ahead, but John Paul II would beatify Titus in the 1980s, and then after a miraculous cure of an American Carmelite based out of Florida, curing his cancer, he would become a saint in 2022. So that's kind of your overview, and I'm barely scratching the surface of this incredible man. So now let's talk about Titus and carrying the cross. So when the nurse, Tizia, the nurse who killed him, when she was testifying at his beatification hearing, she once relayed a conversation that she had with Titus. And she said that she told Titus how much she hates priests. And Titus replied that good priests are not always the ones who are out there preaching loud and beautiful sermons, but the best priests are the ones who are suffering for their flock and uniting their sufferings with Christ. And like I said, this nurse would be so overwhelmed by Titus's witness to Christ that she would convert or revert to Catholicism and put her evil past behind her. And we must remember that Titus did not convert her through his preaching and proselytizing, but he converted her through his humble heart, through his acts of humility, through revealing God to others, revealing the mercy and goodness and even joy of God to others. And this was Titus's Via Crucis. This was Titus's way of the cross. He revealed God to the world through his humility, through his service, through his offering of pain to those away from God. As he was being beaten by the Nazis, I want you to remember this. As he was being beaten by the Nazis, he was using that pain as a prayer. As he was being kicked on the ground and beaten by the Nazis, rather than thinking ill of them, he was offering that pain to Christ. He was offering that pain to God to have mercy on them, for they know not what they do. And this is in line with Jesus too, right? As he was being whipped, as he was being nailed to the cross, he prayed for the same people beating him. And just like Christ, who descended into hell and shined there brightly, Titus went to this hell on earth and shined there too. And there was another Carmelite in Dachau. The Carmelite was named Brother Raphael Titus. And he survived. And that is one of the many reasons why we have so much information on Titus. And it's said that Titus, or Raphael tells us that Titus would often be very kind to the Nazi guards. And even though they would beat him and spit on him, he would be very nice to them. And Raphael would tell Titus to stop. He said nothing good would come from this, except maybe more beatings. You don't know what would come from this. And Titus replied, "You're right, we don't know. And because we don't know, that's why we cannot stop. Because we don't know what's left in them. There still might be something in there. That something being goodness, that something being the image of God. They might not be too stained to save. They might not be too demonized to save." So Titus tells Raphael that is why we must continue to reveal God to them through our actions. And who knows was right, because Fritz Becker, who was one of the head guards and one of the lead operators of Dachau, a man who interacted with Titus often, he reconciled with God before his execution. And this was not the only guard or Nazi figure who is said to have been converted or reverted due to Titus. When he was in Amsterdam, one of his first stays in imprisonment, it said that quite often they would see Nazi guards leaving his cell, making the sign of the cross, and crying, kind of implying that they just had their confessions heard by Titus. So again, the carrying of the cross, it symbolizes the sacrifices that we make in order to reveal God to the world. And previously we defined the Via Crucis, or the way of the cross, as twofold. It's offering up our suffering and our prayers to those away from God. And then it's revealing God through these sacrifices. And Titus, he spent his whole life as a sacrifice. He was a religious. He dedicated his entire life, all of his energy, to revealing God to the world. But he also sacrificed his life by speaking out against the evils of Nazism. And again, he also lost his life. And in those final moments, he still revealed God to the world. And one soul would have been enough. Titia would have been enough for Titus. Titus would have been overjoyed knowing that he brought one person back to God. But he brought many. And again, how did he do it? Not necessarily from preaching beautiful sermons, which, by the way, he did. There is a very beautiful scene where he did preach a Good Friday sermon while imprisoned. So he did that too. But the main way he brought people to God was through his humility and through his love and through loving others, even in hell. So how can you and I relate to this? See, we do not have to necessarily harm ourselves to unite our sufferings with God. Titus was a very happy-go-lucky figure. He often said that Christ said that his yoke and his way was simple and light, therefore we should be lighthearted. We do not have to do these extreme penances. But we must do things that reveal God to others. Feeding the poor, tending to the sick, preaching the gospel. Our goal, as I've said numerous times in my work, is not to believe the right things and then get into heaven, or do the right things and then get into heaven, but we are to become like Our Lady, who was so full of grace as she revealed God to the world. She would become a God-bearer, and this is also very key to Carmelite spirituality. They believe that they too are supposed to become Theotokos, or God-bearers. And St. Titus did that. He revealed God to the world through being so united with God's grace. And you and I can do that as well. It does not have to be in a concentration camp. It does not have to be in a literal hell on earth. But if you are moved to go and preach the gospel in prisons, do it. But even small things, even small acts that reveal God to the world, is what we are called to do. So remember where we are in the Via Crucis. Where are we as we meditate upon the sorrowful mysteries? We have purged ourselves of self-importance. We have purged ourselves of ego. Now carrying the cross is when we start to make these sacrifices that reveal God to the world. So the next time you pray your rosary, the next time you meditate upon these sorrowful mysteries, think about that. What is my sacrifice that will reveal God to others? As I am carrying my cross, how can I use this cross to reveal God to the world? Christ revealed the Father to the world, now you are to reveal the Son, like St. Titus and so many other saints have done. So I hope you've enjoyed this reflection on St. Titus Brandsma, and I hope it encourages you and inspires you to read more on the life of this holy saint. I hope you're having a tremendous Lenten season if you are watching this during Lent. If you're watching it outside of Lent, I hope that this inspires you in your reflections upon the sorrowful mysteries. Please, if you are moved, to like and subscribe and to share this video. May God be with you, and may St. Titus Pray for us.